Hi, everyone. Thanks so much for joining today. We're really looking forward to this discussion on clean hydrogen end uses and considerations for state energy offices. Before we get started, I wanted to provide a few quick Zoom reminders. This is a Zoom meeting rather than a webinar, so please make sure to be on mute if you're not speaking. However, we really do encourage questions and conversation during the Q&A portion, so feel free to raise your hand and come off mute to ask a question, and also feel free to post questions or comments in the chat throughout. And we are recording this meeting, so we'll post the video as well as the slides to NASEO's website later this week. And we're really excited to have a great lineup of speakers today. Next slide. So first, we'll hear from Dr. Sunita Satyapal, the director of the U.S. Department of Energy's Hydrogen Fuel Cell Technologies Office. And then we'll pause for a brief Q&A and discussion with her. And then afterwards, we'll hear from Maria DiBiase-Eisman, Policy Advisor for Special Projects with the Colorado Energy Office. Next, we'll hear from Tessa Weiss, Senior Associate for Climate Aligned Industries with RMI. And finally, we'll hear from David Edwards, Director and Advocate for Hydrogen Energy with Air Liquide. So without further ado, I'll pass it to Sunita to get us started. Thanks so much.
Great, thank you so much, Grace, and it's great to see all of you. And maybe we can, if you're going to share the screen, we can go ahead and I can go ahead and start, and just big thanks to all the states, to NASEO, to all of you here, also from industry. This is such an exciting time for hydrogen. So since it sounded like the main interest was end use opportunities, I thought I'd focus there. But if we start in terms of the first slide, and would it be easier for me to share? Use the pointer? I can do that too.
I can see the slides on my end. Can anyone else see them?
I can see them. Yeah.
Oh, okay.
If you want to go to the next slide. Here, just again, to set the stage and from the big picture perspective in terms of what our challenge is, you can see basically CO2 across the different applications and the administration's goals of getting to net zero by 2050. And you can see the interim goals as well, the NDC, National Determined Country Target there. And then the fact that, the goal is really to get to a clean grid by 2035. And so the key here is we have an all of the above portfolio, and hydrogen, of course, can play a role across the different applications. And many countries are recognizing to meet their climate goals, we need that carbon-free molecule. It's not just electrification. So that really sets the context. And if we go to the next slide, this shows, I think, hopefully many of you are familiar with our H2 at Scale initiative shown on the left, and really looking at all of our resources. Once we produce that hydrogen, use it as a fuel, as a feedstock. And there are two main documents for those who are maybe not as familiar with the DOE program: the program plan, which was published in 2020, and then the national strategy, which was issued as a draft. And we've had listening sessions as well with some of you on that. And then the other thing I wanted to highlight just in the org chart picture is just, again, there are many new offices involved in hydrogen, so on the federal side, but how we really are really trying to focus on this cohesive, coordinated efforts. And we have those familiar with the office alphabet chart here, but renewables, fossil with CCS, nuclear. We have a new Office of Clean Energy Demonstrations, our Loan Program Office. On the science side, ARPA-E, science, are supporting, kind of cross-cutting, supporting offices like Office of Technology Transfer, International Affairs, and so forth. So anyway, the main point is that, we provide funding out to industry, labs, universities, states. And so I'd love to have kind of more of a discussion on what more can we be doing, with the states. And then we're also, just for awareness, working really closely with our interagency counterparts as well on specifically on hydrogen and addressing some of the challenges. So if we go to the next slide, here again, just as a snapshot, this keeps changing, so it's already out of date, but I think most of you know we produce, roughly 10 million metric tons of hydrogen, about 10% of the global capacity. You can see that, we have pipelines, we have three caverns, and then most of the states have hydrogen production capacity. And then this maps out the PEM electrolyzers, and we'll have a new version of this. But also, just again, as a snapshot in time, the examples of deployments, since it seemed like the interest was really those end use applications. So stationary backup power, forklifts is an example, again, very specific. Infrastructure. I should have mentioned we have a joint office also with transportation. So we have quite a bit of infrastructure funding on the table. But if we go to the next slide, and I'll go pretty quickly just to leave time for discussion. But again, from the perspective of the market, kind of market-driven end use applications, this lays the framework for the national strategy. And basically the national goals of 10 million metric tons of clean hydrogen by 2030, and then up to 50 million by 2050. And that's aligned with the White House long-term climate strategy of basically enabling about 10% of total national CO2 emissions reduction possible with hydrogen. And then the picture kind of shows different end uses and how it might evolve over time, and basically catalyzing the use in the existing industries to start with. So, obviously like ammonia, refineries, and then initiating some of the newer uses as we see the infrastructure build out, the cost coming down. So like SAFs, there's a lot of interest, obviously, in exports. And then we see over time scaling up, especially as we get the infrastructure, heavy duty transport, energy storage as well, in terms of enabling a renewable grid. And the key message, though, on this slide I wanted to emphasize is there's so much uncertainty. So if you look on the right, we have the dark green, which are core scenarios. So how much hydrogen for each of those sectors. And then the optimistic and kind of conservative scenarios with the light green. So especially now that we have the IRA, we have, the hubs are not yet decided. I think it's really important for all of us to kind of have that humility and know that we don't know exactly what the number is going to be, but we'll keep updating this. And the key really is to set these kind of metrics in terms of what we see the opportunity is. So if we keep going to the next slide, here, what I wanted to do is, hopefully you all saw the commercial liftoff reports that were just announced by DOE, a lot there. This is, kind of the first draft, and the goal is to get feedback. So across, multiple offices here. And the main takeaway, I know it's a little hard to read, but is now that we have the $3 PTC, the question is, which one of those which of those applications start to become more competitively, viable. And so the white circles kind of show where the break-even point, potentially would have been. And then the light green circles are basically, in specific cases, how the PTC is allowing, those segments to be competitive. So we start to see the break-even and more commercial viability for those. And so again, and you see some differences, like with the heavy duty trucks, for instance, well, with the LCFS, we can start to see those being, as to be expected, competitive earlier, even without the LCFS. It's more like 2030. Again, the devil's in the details here, but at least it's kind of a high level pictorial of which end use applications start to look more viable. And then again, there's a lot of uncertainty because we still need to get the cost of infrastructure, get the stations, and so forth. So the next slide, I wanted to focus again on some of the newest, right, hot off the shelf data. And all this will be updated. This is also from our OTT and LPO analysis, which included a lot of industry input. And so you can see again some of the most recent project announcements. So they're also kind of consistent with the strategy and what you expect. You see ammonia, a lot of interest there, projects announced, and then the sustainable aviation fuels as well, and liquid fuels. And then you can see again this is also just one snapshot in time, so don't read too much into it, but at least it gives you an idea of what some of those public announcements are. And then I think if we keep going, this also was from the report, and it also shows basically of the announcements where across the country you see some of these announcements, and we're staying away from colors, but obviously there's blue and there's green, and what's it's a little bit hard to see, but I think an important point is 10.5 million metric tons basically includes kind of integrated projects, which I think is so critical because we keep focusing on production with the PTC and so forth, and we really need to ensure that we don't have stranded assets. And so the more we can kind of make sure we have the off-takers and that demand, the more critical it is. So again, this is just one piece of information. I think these, thanks for the question, Stephanie, are the public projects. So we haven't, made those concept paper information public, if there's anything that's not already public within them. And so if we go to the next slide, here again, because it was a kind of a state and NASEO perspective, I thought it might be helpful to show this is from our H2 at scale analyses, and kind of where across the country you see the resources, wind, solar, biomass, starting to map out offshore wind. And then in our industrial decarbonization report, again, it's a little hard to see, it's in the national strategy, but where the potential end uses are, so across different industries. And then here too, as we think really strategically, where could we see potential things? So, CO2, and where could there be, hydrogen plus CO2, let's say long term. So again, mapping out this, I thought might be helpful for states to see. And then the next slide is also in our national strategy, but starting to map out where could there be potential storage, so large scale storage infrastructure. So, obviously there's the salt domes. There may be some other opportunities, just the hard rock formations. We could use some of the depleted oil and gas fields. We have some analysis underway also on kind of the many, let's say around 10 tons of storage. So something sort of in between the really large scale geological caverns. So again, that gives you an idea of where these are. So if we keep going, I think the last kind of takeaway I wanted to end with was just the whole importance of collaboration, the DEIAs, and environmental justice. We go to the next slide. As I think many of you know, a really top priority for the administration is energy, environmental justice, Justice 40 initiative, a lot of discussion on how do we really quantify those benefits. And so I thought I would just share kind of just one example of various activities, even internationally. So we have like an H2 Twin Cities effort, partnering across continents, trying to share best practices, lessons learned, workforce. I thought I'd do a shout out for one example of a project that we're funding with UPS. Trucks that actually double the range compared to the battery vehicle will have 15 in a disadvantaged community. And that showing those really concrete benefits, I think, is really critical. So we get lots of questions, but CO2 reduction, air quality benefits, and so forth. We have another one project with resiliency at a fuel cell microgrid. So just lots and lots of efforts there. So just wanted to stress this and see if there are ideas also that states might have on how we can work together on the EJ and kind of DEIA activities. That would be great. And then finally, I think the last slide was just lots of resources available. So if you're interested, say the date, June 5th, we have our annual merit reviews here in DC, hundreds of projects. We have an interagency, and we've had kind of state activities also presented, and then H2 Matchmaker as well to help kind of facilitate formation of the hubs and kind of matching, having that transparency to see where's their interest in terms of production and end use, and lots and lots of interest of ensuring that we do have those off takers and sustained demand. So I think with the next slide, I think was my last slide. So thanks again for organizing this.
Thank you so much, Sunita. And now we have a few minutes for Q&A and discussion. So invite everyone to think of questions, raise your hand, anything in the chat, and we'll open the floor. Or Sunita, if there are questions you'd like to pose to any of
Yes.
us, feel free.
Yeah, I would love to, especially kind of from the state perspective. Like in the past, we've had workshops. We've had a lot of interest, with from specific states. And so we've had, we're trying to, obviously, because of the hubs, BOA and other, we have so much, open. We're trying to be careful about how we engage. But if there are ideas in terms of, not related to the hubs, but what more can we be doing, working together? There's so many, different state programs. Again, we've had some good examples with some of the states historically. So, especially California, even jointly funded activities, a lot of interest in the Northeast. I know we have fuel cell kind of associations or coalitions in various states. But in terms of the state agencies, be great to hear if, and we don't have to do it right now, but if there are ideas on what more can we be doing together. We've done, webinars in the past with NASEO as well. So it'd be great to hear any thoughts.
Sunita, I can just get us started. I'm a colleague of Grace's at NASEO, and I think a lot of the state energy offices are really interested in exploring clean hydrogen roadmaps for the state. And I don't know if you have any advice or resources or suggestions for those states interested in developing roadmaps that you could share.
Yeah, and we did this actually more than a decade ago, where I don't know if some of you might know Joel Reinbold, but in Connecticut with CCAT, and we actually had examples. Multiple states actually did this, and there were roadmaps, and it actually went through the supply chain, even looked at job projections. So that's something, if you're interested, I can share. And if some states are interested in doing something like that, that could be an option.
Great. Yeah, happy to share that with the states. Thank you.
And maybe one other thing I'll mention in terms of, especially with hydrogen, now that we have the joint office. So we have hydrogen.energy.gov, which is sort of a portal. We have other, activities, even with other agencies. Mentioned DOT, we have a lot with DOD. And so I think disseminating information, and it's great to see Connor here also from FACHIA. That's one challenge. So sometimes you don't see hydrogen like that prominent within a funding opportunity. But for instance, the joint office, we have the infrastructure funding, and that would be for EV chargers, but hydrogen infrastructure is also eligible. So I think just disseminating that information and trying to help, applicants wherever possible to know about it, help ensure, good proposals. Everything is done, at a competitive kind of from a merit review based process. And so it's really important to, try to make sure proposals are really well done. And I should mention that very often we have, even with our other open FOA right now, which includes some of the manufacturing, we often have a website, like a teaming website, like during the open process. So they're also, you may be interested in kind of disseminating that within your various regions. So those who maybe don't quite know how to partner, might be disadvantaged community or tribal community, that they can sort of, self-identify and look at others who might be interested. So partnering up, that might be another approach.
Definitely. It looks like Stephanie has a question in the chat about industrial users who are interested in replacing certain natural gas fueled equipment with hydrogen. Does DOE have any assistance or information on that?
Yeah, we do have also an industrial decarbonization roadmap and a lot of effort there. In fact, there was just a roundtable, a lot of White House engagements. And then we do have specific in our industrial decarbonization office. And Advanced Manufacturing Office, we do have some tech assistance programs. So if there's specific questions, we can probably forward it. And then we also have, depending on, if they're interested in blends, we have the High Blend Initiative that we launched, which has over 30 now, maybe 40 partners, HMAT Consortium. So they're also bringing our national labs in, depending on, the type of assistance they need. That's an option as well. So they can point them to the High Blend website.
Awesome. That's really helpful. Thank you. And any final questions in the States? And we're happy to follow up and provide some of these resources after the webinar as well, or connect you to anyone. But thank you so much, Dr. Satyapal. It's been a pleasure to have you.
Thank you. And I'll try to stay for as long as I can, but I might drop off early.
No, you have a busy schedule.
Nice to see everyone.
Great. All right. So next up, we have Maria Eisman with the Colorado Energy Office. So feel free to take it away.
Thanks for having me today. What an honor to follow Sunita. I'm going to talk to you about our low carbon hydrogen roadmap. If you go to the next slide. I think you'll see that we follow a lot of what Sunita just presented, but in our findings. But anyway, why did Colorado do a low carbon hydrogen roadmap? Well, we had some policies and actions that set the stage for that. Colorado has some really ambitious GHG reduction goals. They are 26% by 2025, 50% by 2030, and 90% by 2050 from 2005 levels. So in order for us to understand and provide a roadmap for how we were going to reach those goals, we did a Colorado GHG roadmap to ensure we would make progress towards them. That roadmap told us that low carbon fuels such as hydrogen was going to be essential after 2030, and that we needed to, in order to get there, we needed to start ramping up between 2025 and 2030. So in order to really better understand how we would do that, that's when we decided to do and develop this opportunities of low carbon hydrogen in Colorado roadmap. And that identified actions the state could take to fold into that goal and reach those targets. Next slide. So the study had some objectives. First of all, we wanted to define what we meant by low carbon hydrogen, and then kind of do the lay of the land. What is the state of the market in the world, the US and Colorado, opportunities for hydrogen in Colorado, steps we could take to overcome barriers to build a hydrogen economy in the state, and economic potential of a Colorado hydrogen economy. And our final deliverable was a 15-year roadmap with some key success factors, recommended actions, and production and investment targets. And I'm not going to go through all of this. I'm just going to show you some information about end uses. Next slide. So, but just to level set here, low carbon hydrogen, we defined as in the study as hydrogen produces significantly reduced life cycle GHG emissions, kind of getting to what Sunita presented on, decarbonizing where hydrogen is already being used in the state from fossil sources. But basically in our study, we were talking about green hydrogen from renewable electricity and blue hydrogen from a fossil source with carbon capture and storage. Next slide. So Colorado has some really great all the states have advantages for hydrogen. Colorado has quite a few it's a big state with high elevation, so vehicles need long driving ranges. We have a large oil and gas industry providing some infrastructure and opportunities for storage. And then we have a lot of interest in the state. We have a Colorado Hydrogen Network, and the National Renewable Energy Lab, as well as our universities, are really engaged, among other things, and a cold climate as well. Next slide. So I really like this presentation of where the opportunities for end use are in Colorado. And this particular graphic on the, the column is commercialization opportunity, and then across the top, the row is the cost effectiveness of these different end uses. And so up in the upper right-hand corner, we see forklifts, which is a, we already have hydrogen forklifts in the state, but it's, it's a relatively small opportunity there. Moving down, we see medium and heavy duty vehicles. And I'd like to emphasize that this was done before the IIJA and the IRA came out. So that, the opportunities there may have skewed this differently had we done it after that, but we did this before those came out. So anyway, we see medium and heavy duty vehicles over on that left-hand side. And then you see, as we move towards the right, that we have, heavy duty vehicles and other heavy duty transportation kind of equal size opportunity. There's also in the transportation sector, buses, not as big of an opportunity there, but still, solid opportunity for the state. We have a really big opportunity kind of in that medium category and electric long duration storage or peaking. And then in the industrial side, refining and industrial manufacturing. Way over on the right there, you'll see light duty vehicles and commercial and residential heating. And the reason those ended up on that side of the opportunities is because they were outcompeted by other low carbon opportunities such as electrification. Next slide, and I'll talk more about them. Yeah, so I just wanted to share a couple more findings from the study. This talks about refueling costs in Colorado. Our study showed us that in order for hydrogen to be competitive with other fuel, with diesel, it would have to come in at $6 to $8 per kilogram by 2030. And that we found that pump prices using off-site hydrogen production was the most cost-effective compared to on-site production now and in the future, because electrolyzers using electricity from the grid may have higher electricity prices than using off-grid electricity, like excess solar and wind, for example. The renewable type of sources there. However, off-site production, if it was coming in by pipeline, presented some cost challenges because you needed the infrastructure for it, of course, and that's likely to become viable only at scale. However, pump prices across all the scenarios were expected to decline as electrolyzer costs came down and the station economics improved with greater scale and usage. Next slide. And the other finding I'll share with you again is both of them are in the transportation sector. But again, when we're looking at medium and heavy duty vehicles, I'm going to show you just some of how the costs worked out. On the right hand side, we look at medium and heavy duty vehicles, and they're shown in the heavy duty vehicles segment that it's more cost effective solution compared to electric vehicles now and in the future on a per weight basis, and that is because electric long range vehicles have a higher weight. That's because of the batteries they're carrying, and that it provides lower cargo space, which brings up the cost for them to transport. And so hydrogen vehicles have an advantage there. In the light duty segment, battery electric vehicles remain a more operationally cost-effective option now and in the future, as they have better fuel economies and lower fuel costs than the light duty fuel cell vehicles. Next slide. So after, we did our study, we released our study in October, and in November out came the IIJA. So, but what the study told us, it recommended that we do, our study said we should develop a hydrogen plan, investigate market interest and feasibility of an early development hydrogen hub, and then develop some pilot projects in the power sector and in the blending of hydrogen and existing gas infrastructure, and then issue a request for information to potential hydrogen market participants to assess the feasibility of pilots. Next slide. And so, as I said, our study was just 1 month ahead of the IIJA, which allocated money for regional hydrogen hubs. So we felt, given what our study had shown us and what our GHG roadmap had showed us, this really was a great opportunity for the state. And as our roadmap suggested, we saw a better opportunity to make it a regional effort. So next study. The next slide. And so we decided that we would pursue the hub effort rather than do a Colorado focused effort as suggested from our study. So in February of 22, the states of Colorado, New Mexico, and Utah signed an MOU and agreed to work together exclusively to compete for a DOE regional clean hydrogen hub program called the Western Interstates Hydrogen Hub. We hired a prime contractor, Atkins, and under their direction and with collaboration from research entities, we did submit a concept paper, which was encouraged. As you all know, full proposals are due on April 7th. We're working hard on that, but what's really interesting is what our roadmap found is very closely aligns with what we're doing in the hub effort. Next slide. And so you can stay informed. We have a web page dedicated to the Western Interstates Hydrogen Hub on the Colorado Energy Office website. And here's a link to our study. And I think that was my last slide. Next slide. So thank you. There's my contact information.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Maria. And I know we're tight on time, so I'll go ahead and pass it on to Tessa with RMI.
Thanks, Grace, and thanks, Maria and Sunita, for great federal and state level perspectives. I think I'm going to pull things out a little bit more and talk a very systems level perspective of where we at RMI view prioritization of hydrogen's end uses. Before I dive in, introduction of myself. My name is Tessa Weiss. I'm a senior associate within our Climate Aligned Industries program at RMI. I focus primarily on supporting the development of US-based hydrogen hubs, looking at regulations of grid-connected electrolysis in terms of how we ensure emissions as well as scale up of hydrogen are supported, as well as looking at the potential for disaggregation and decentralization of ammonia production technologies for fertilizer applications. Going to the next slide. So at RMI, we really view the need to prioritize hydrogen for the hard to abate sectors where there are no other alternatives for decarbonization. And this is largely coming from this systems level perspective of the massive amounts of infrastructure and costs associated with our efforts to reach 1.5 degrees C alignment compared to the kind of plethora of options that we could see of how we reach that path. And there's a significant risk of allocating resources towards non-priority applications that could limit availability for pathways that have no other alternative to reach their emissions goals. Looking at applications that need hydrogen for decarbonization, we think about applications where hydrogen is already being used as a chemical feedstock or is really the main chemical feedstock necessary to reduce emissions. Thinking about petrochemicals and fertilizer, the present day 10 million metric tons of production and usage of hydrogen that we see in the US, largely located in the Gulf, being a prime example of assets that need to transition, as well as in steel, replacing coking coal with a clean hydrogen alternative to reduce emissions. We also think about applications where hydrogen can be used to replace fuel for heavy duty transport applications. So thinking about maritime shipping, thinking about long haul trucking as first priorities given their technology readiness. And then thinking about aviation as really being a core priority for future use of hydrogen, but just being slightly lower on the technological readiness scale for hydrogen or a hydrogen derived fuel to be used in that sector. We do view use of hydrogen for applications where there are other decarbonization alternatives, oftentimes other decarbonization alternatives that are more efficient in terms of the amount of energy they need to achieve this emissions reduction, to be better suited for a non-hydrogen based application. So thinking about peaking power or building heat, oftentimes being well suited for use of electrons directly. Going to the next slide. To provide high level perspective on the emissions impact we see of hydrogen's replacement of the various present day use of fossil fuel in this sector, we see steel being a front runner in terms of the emissions reductions that we can see through replacement of coke and coal with the clean hydrogen alternative. All of these are benchmarking of fossil fuel with a zero carbon hydrogen based alternative, followed by really these heavy industrial, heavy transportation applications. We see, as I alluded to, use of hydrogen for power generation and building heat, achieving a far lower emissions reduction. This is largely coming from the low amount of energy that is stored in a certain space of hydrogen. So hydrogen takes up a lot of space to achieve the same amount of energy that, say, natural gas does for power generation or building heat. And when we start to replace natural gas with hydrogen, we do not see an equal emissions reduction per the amount of hydrogen that we are replacing on a volume by volume basis. So for example, if I were to blend natural gas with hydrogen, 20% of that being blended on a volume basis, only 7% of the emissions would be reduced. Going to the next slide. We've started to look at what is the strategy for, say, market entry or thresholds of cost competitiveness that we see across various applications of hydrogen in sectors. And what we find is there's this dynamic that emerges that given the threshold of cost competitiveness of hydrogen's adoption in the sector, it both motivates from a producer standpoint what makes sense for project economics, as well as from a kind of early adoption and scale up perspective, what is possible. So from a hydrogen producer's perspective, if I am able to produce hydrogen at a certain price point, I might think about targeting applications where I can get higher revenue for that same produced kilogram. So thinking about applications like trucking, small scale backup power generation, aviation, steel, where there is a higher willingness to pay and a higher benchmark of how much that hydrogen will be sold for than in applications such as residential heating or baseload power, et cetera, where there's really a kind of low dollar per kilogram threshold at which that hydrogen will be sold at. On the flip side, we can look at this as far as what does this look like in terms of scaling up of the technology, where sectors that have a higher threshold willingness to pay for hydrogen could be able to absorb higher price points. And so it enables hydrogen production pathways or locations that are not as, say, low cost to start to come online and start to have off-takers. Now, with the hydrogen production tax credit, a lot of this logic that would naturally sort out applications into higher priority being prioritized, higher priority meaning the applications that critically need the hydrogen to decarbonize, it's created a new set of incentives where now hydrogen is economic across a broader breadth of applications. We can go to the next slide. So we've seen that with the production tax credit, that it's dramatically reduced the cost of green hydrogen and sometimes can reach it to parity with that of renewables. Looking at this chart, so the light blue bars are looking at the subsidized costs, so looking at costs of either renewable power generation or green hydrogen-based power generation with any production tax credits available. The darker blue bars are looking at what are those costs without. With the production tax credit, these costs have fallen for green hydrogen's use in the power sector, say 3 to 4 times. The risk here is these tax credits are time limited. They're available for 10 years. And this could create a significant stranded asset risk of projects that come online, taking perhaps a more narrow view of what does the cost competitiveness look like now compared to what is the long-term resiliency in terms of the project's ability to be competitive over time. And so this is a dynamic that I encourage us all to be aware of how do we think about short-term versus long-term planning, and how are we thinking about making decisions at this point in time in light of nearly the false economic structuring that and incentives that we see compared to the lifetime of these 30-year-long assets. If we go to the next slide. So we've also looked at a risk of what could investments in these, say, non-priority, largely baseload power or building heating applications look like in terms of our holistic ability to decarbonize. So from an efficiency perspective, using green hydrogen as opposed to just using renewables directly will result in over 60% less net electricity generated from your system. And this is because it's largely inefficient to take solar or wind power, create hydrogen to create electricity again, as opposed to using those electrons directly. And this creates a risk as far as meeting any sort of state or federal goals in terms of rollout of renewables, in terms of if I'm allocating my limited amount of renewables for applications that are 60% more inefficient in terms of their power generation, I am taking away availability of resources to be used to directly decarbonize other applications. And from that systems level perspective, we don't have an abundance of resources to be used, and we really do need to be thinking about what is the efficiency in terms of energy use, what is the, as well as long-term kind of cost projections that we will see of these technologies. That's all I have today. Thank you for your time, and feel free to reach out to me with any questions that you might have as a result of this. My contact information is my first initial last name, tweiss@rmi.org.
Great. Thanks so much, Tessa. And Dave, I'll turn it over to you.
Excellent. Thanks so much, and thanks for the invite to have an industry spokesperson in the room today for the discussion. I have the luxury of going last, which means I can take advantage of all the great presentations that have preceded me because they have covered almost all of the points that I would want to make on background on hydrogen. So in an effort to shorten things up and get to the discussion, which is probably more interesting, I'll skip over a few of my background slides, but let's go to the next slide. My name is Dave Edwards. I work for a company called Air Liquide. We're a very large industrial gas company. We work in almost every country in the world, and we produce almost every industrial gas from oxygen, nitrogen, helium, carbon dioxide. Hydrogen is at the core of our growth, and for now is getting a lot of attention within our business. I will have some Air Liquide specific slides as I present, but I'll try to give an industry perspective as much as a individual company's perspective. If you go to the next slide. From an Air Liquide perspective and from an industrial perspective, we've got more than 50 years of experience in this industry, but mostly, as you've already seen, that industry is focused on things like refineries and ammonia production. It's through large industrial sectors like the Gulf Coast of the United States, and it's aiming toward those industrial sectors. And even though we're already producing it at very large scale, in very large quantities, those molecules generally aren't available and aren't low carbon enough for the new needs that we're talking about in the energy transition. So let's go to the next slide. And the next slide after this one. So today's model, and I have a spider diagram that looks similar to Sunita's, and almost every slide has one, but today's industrial processes are really quite straightforward. We start with generally a fossil gas network. Through various reforming processes, we produce hydrogen. In most cases, that goes into pipelines or is produced on site where it's needed, and it's going to these existing industrial sectors. As we go to the next slide, you're going to see a lot of additions. Everything that gets added between the last slide and this slide are now the things that are opportunities in the new energy transformation. Every blue line represents an investment in infrastructure. How are we going to get hydrogen to these new applications? Everything in orange on the right are these new applications in mobility, in power generation, industrial uses, and in commercial and residential heating, for example. And at the left side of this, it's all of the new renewables that need to come online in order to enable the production of hydrogen, keeping in mind that there remains a hydrocarbon-based production and a renewable hydrocarbons through things like renewable natural gas, but predominantly through the electrolysis process, either from the grid or from behind the meter, wind and solar, but also leveraging things like nuclear and other hydropower and other low carbon electricity production sites. So keep in mind that all of the new stuff on this slide are the things that we're talking about. And each one of these elements, each box or each arrow represents hundreds of millions of dollars of investment to match the kind of investments we've made over the decades in the industrial sector that I showed initially. Let's go to the next slide. When we think about the renewable grid, the role for hydrogen is multi. One is we're using the grid or electricity as a feedstock through electrolysis to produce that hydrogen, but we're also complementing the grid by providing large-scale energy storage. As we think about unbalanced supply and demand from wind and solar, we have a need for large-scale storage. Large-scale storage and long-time storage is enabled by hydrogen. Hydrogen storage in caverns, hydrogen storage as a liquid, hydrogen storage, a number of different mechanisms. And once that hydrogen molecule is generated, it has value in multiple pathways. We saw it in the previous presentations that it can go into the mobility markets, it can go back into power generation, it can be used for backup power, and it can be used in the industrial sectors. So unlike a lot of other energy storage options, hydrogen has the option of interconnecting to new sectors in ways that the other large-scale storage might have difficulty with. And I put in a data point to just give an example of what we're talking about with scale on the basis of Texas. Texas today, these numbers might be a little bit out of date, about 29 gigawatts of power in the state, the largest state in the US for hydrogen or for wind power production, with something like 25,000 wind-related jobs. If we could redirect all of that electricity into electrolyzers and into fuel tanks, it would be enough fuel for every car that's in Texas. So you can get a feel for the scale of the kind of problems we're trying to solve. All of the wind that's already in Texas is what would be needed just for the light duty vehicles in that state. And you can think about how that maps to all the individual states and all the individual areas of energy, whether that's wind, whether that's solar, whether that's existing nuclear, whether that's existing other power, and the scale of the problems we're trying to solve and how hydrogen might play into that. Let's go to the next slide. Just to give some examples, I know Sunita showed a map with a lot of green and blue dots on it. A couple of those dots are actually real projects, and industry is stepping into this new arena by making fairly significant investments, and I'm showing two here that our company has made. The first is a new production facility in Nevada. We spent about $250 million to bring a 30-ton per day liquid plant online. That plant is operating today and providing fuel into the West Coast markets, mostly to California. A lot of that going to the existing light duty stations, but a lot of it also going into warehousing, for example. And then on the East Coast in Quebec, we made a $40 million investment in electrolyzer. At the time, it was the largest electrolyzer operating. I think that has been surpassed now many times over, but it's producing 8 tons of liquid for the East Coast markets in Canada and the United States. That system's now been operating for a couple of years. And so when you see those kind of maps that Sunita shows, even though a lot of those might be speculative about future investments, they do represent hundreds of millions of dollars of investment, and it's building on that existing industrial infrastructure that's in place for the existing markets, for example. Let's go to the next slide. And the next one after this. So I have two slides that kind of bring an industry perspective to some of the things that we think about in the hydrogen markets. The first is the importance of markets and scale. That when we think about policies at either the state or the federal level, we have to balance the priorities of the populace. There are environmental outcomes, economic outcomes, and societal outcomes. We have to have things like the greenhouse gas reductions, but don't underestimate the health effects of reducing the emissions from heavy duty vehicles, for example. Greenhouse gases is a global issue that needs to be addressed, but the health effects are local. When you take a truck off of your local highway, that is your local populace health that's impacted directly. From an economic perspective, we have to have affordable, available, and reliable energy. It's unacceptable to have anything else. That energy, if it can be domestic and can drive local investments, becomes well coordinated then with the policy of a state, for example. And then in the societal aspects, I know Sunita had a couple of slides on the DEIA activities and disadvantaged community impacts need to be addressed as part of these investments, for example. And just a few sort of motherhood statements at the bottom that all of these solutions require scale. It doesn't solve any of the societal problems we have if we don't do this at the kind of scale that we need on a national energy level. but that scale is going to require private investment. In the end, it's private investment at an order of 10 to 100 times government investment that leads to the kind of investments we're looking at. But that requires balance in the market to be encouraged by policies, especially in the early days of adoption. And private investment requires a market. We've talked a lot today about hydrogen production. We haven't talked as much about how we encourage those markets to adopt low carbon hydrogen. And so from our perspective, from an industry perspective, that private investment needs open, stable, and competitive markets, and we need policies that encourage that as an outcome. When we think about the hydrogen hubs, for example, that are enabled by the IIJA, an $8 billion infusion into a number of regional hubs is fantastic. But in our minds, only if it results in a market that then we can invest not $8 billion, but $80 billion or $800 billion in the growth of that market in order to meet the scale that we're looking for. If I go to the next slide. And then if I look at the role of policy, there's really 4 elements that we like to see in policies that encourages those kind of outcomes. The first is specific to a sector. If you think about connecting any energy source to any hydrogen use, there's a number of areas you need to address if you're going to encourage it with policy. One is you need to look at the fuel. Are you prioritizing the outcomes of carbon intensity, of criteria pollutants, over specific pathways that are mandated? If you mandate specific pathways, it won't result either in the lowest carbon or the lowest cost results, because you've taken away the ability to optimize against carbon intensity, for example. Are you able to leverage all of your available resources? Wind, solar, nuclear, renewable natural gas, carbon capture. Different regions in the US have different energy balances and need to be able to leverage all of those different resources. And some examples of policies that actually do these things, the most recently in the IRA, the 45V hydrogen production tax credit, the 45Q CCS benefits, things like the LCFS program in California are examples of policies that meet this element. The second thing you need to look at is the distribution or infrastructure required to bring the molecules to the market. There's a balance between what's public and private ownership of the infrastructure. If we think about the mobility markets, is it going to be on-road distribution? Will there be pipelines available? Who's going to own and operate bulk caverns and pipelines, for example? What about refueling stations? And the one lesson we've learned in every place where we brought new energy through hydrogen is that the infrastructure must precede the end use. You cannot adopt a vehicle if you don't have refueling available. You can't have a fueling station if you don't have the fuel available for it. And then the third of the elements related to the sector is the end use must be encouraged, whether that's the transportation industry, the power generation, or industrial sectors. Focus on those areas that have high concentration densities of energy, things like ports, warehousing districts, and data centers, for example. Look at the adoption costs, and for vehicles, for example, vehicle regulations and incentives for vehicle adoption, for example, help encourage that end use. And some examples of that are the California ZEV portfolio programs, the Clean Cars Acts, ACT, ACF, ICT. These are all encouraging that end use adoption. And then the last element that sometimes we skip when we think about hydrogen is the value of cross-sector markets. If you only focus on a single sector, such as transportation, you don't utilize and you don't result in the kind of scale that brings the cost and economic and environmental impact to bear. And so think about how you can utilize the same production and distribution infrastructure to enable scale across those different sectors. And if we go to the next slide. And so to summarize just the points that I've made, hydrogen has the potential to enable the transition. Scale is the important characteristic. But we would like to see policies that encourage the outcomes that best enable these market and these drivers. And that's in fuel production, distribution infrastructure, end users, and the cross-sector growth. With that, I can end. I see we're almost out of time, but I appreciate the opportunity to speak.
Fantastic. Thanks so much, Dave. And we'll open the floor now for any questions from the audience for Maria, Dave, or Tessa. I think Sunita did have to jump off for another call, but we've got 3 great experts, so feel free to ask away. And you're welcome to post questions in the chat or raise your hand and come off mute if that's easier.
So I see there's a question about cost reduction and stranded assets, for example. And I think one of the comments that I would build on what Tessa was talking about, the danger of having policies that are in place for 10 years from the production tax credit, for example. Success in the production tax credit would be that after 10 years, you've enabled a market that can now make investments without the production tax credit, that you've brought the cost down sufficiently, that the market is sufficiently large, and that we're doing things at scale so the costs are manageable by the end users. I think that's the intent of the production tax credit, rather than for it to be an indefinite benefit that would apply to the industry. And that's a careful consideration of what's the timeline that would enable that. Is 10 years sufficient? Keeping in mind that these investments, the ones I showed, for example, are 30-year investments.
Thanks, Dave. Jack, I think you had a question.
Yeah, I just want to get your opinions on whether you feel that hydrogen really beyond long haul trucking and vehicle transportation really is going to be able to compete with electric vehicles. A number of you mentioned that sector, but with the foothold that EVs already have in place, wouldn't that seem to be a more of a focus than looking at hydrogen?
Frankly, for light duty transportation, so passenger transport or even like mid-scale trucking, we do see electrification being the dominant solution there. Really, hydrogen has this necessity to play for these longer distance trucking applications that critically see an advantage when we start to move towards automation of trucking, where refueling time becomes a core value add in terms of how you can start to maximize your miles traveled. And when we think about moving to an automated trucking, that advantage of the short refueling time for a hydrogen powered truck becomes a core value add. And you don't see that, say, across various applications. Frankly, just the efficiency and cost of electrification for passenger transport will just continue to outcompete likely the cost of using hydrogen for a passenger car.
And I think to build on that, you're going to find that the two are complementary to each other. We as a society need to go to 100% zero emission vehicles. And 100% means every person that drives a car needs to have access to zero emission. Every mobility application today needs to have a zero emission option. And battery electric, absolutely. Whenever you can use battery electric, whenever you have access to charging, whenever it meets the utilization need, it is going to be one of the best solutions. And it certainly has already shown that for light duty vehicles. But there's a large part of the population that's going to have difficulty with charging, whether they have access because of where they live or on-street parking or multi-unit dwellings, that inevitably there will even be a light-duty role for fuel cell vehicles. As vehicles get larger and larger, batteries become more and more challenging and fuel cells become better and better solutions. As rates go up, fuel cells become better solutions, for example. So different markets, different sectors, and different utilizations are going to have a different balance of what the right solution is. But across the whole spectrum, you're going to find that they complement one another and provide options for people that have different utilization needs in different markets.
And I would just emphasize what they both said. And our study actually shows that the light duty sector, the battery electric vehicles are going to outcompete on a cost competitive basis the hydrogen fuel cell electric vehicles, and the long haul trucking shows a really good value in the hydrogen fuel cell sector.
Great. Well, we are 1 minute over, so I'll let everyone go, but thank you all so much for joining today. And thank you to Tessa, Maria, and Dave for sharing your insights. And we will be following up with the recording, the slides, and feel free to get in touch with any of the speakers or with NASEO if you have further questions.
Thanks,
Everybody.
Thanks all.
Thank you.